to the second day that we are looking at what Jesus did his last week from Palm Sunday to Easter and on his way to the cross. Yesterday, we saw from the triumphant entry. He stopped off at a city called Bethany, about 2 miles outside Jerusalem. And we saw on the first day, he enters the temple, creates a ruckus, and then returns. And now we're on Tuesday, and Tuesday's a big day. He spends most of the day teaching and preaching, and it's just a busy day for Jesus. And in Matthew, it takes up about 5 chapters of the whole book of Matthew are on this one day. In Mark, it takes about 3 chapters. And it starts in Mark chapter 11 in verse 20. And it's right after the events that we looked at yesterday. But listen to this. It says, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered. And Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it'll be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive. And if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you of your trespasses. So Tuesday of this day in the last week of Jesus' life is broken up into 3 scenes. The first scene happens as they're coming back into the city of Jerusalem. And they pass that same fig tree that we saw yesterday that Jesus cursed, and they're surprised, they're shocked. Why? Because when Jesus curses, it actually comes about. It's not just like how we see somewhere like, man, curse you. I wish you were gone. I wish you were out of my life, something like that. But yet, our cursing has no power, right? Jesus comes up to the fig tree. There's no figs. He's hungry. He's hangry. And he says, cursed are you, right? To the fig tree. And then guess what? 24 hours later, the fig tree is withered. The fig tree is cursed. And if you're the disciples, you're standing back going, oh, when Jesus curses, they're actually cursed. And we find through the Bible, what God blesses is blessed, and what God curses is cursed. What Jesus blesses gets blessed, and what Jesus curses gets cursed. So it's an incredible moment for the disciples to realize there's some kind of different authority in Jesus' cursing. And if I was there, I'd go, I don't want Jesus to curse me. I don't want to be cursed. And remember why the fig tree was cursed? It was cursed because it never came into season. It never bloomed. And it represented Israel, God's people. They had all of God's provisions, and yet they never became fruitful. They had the law. The law didn't produce fruit. They had the prophets and the priests and the tabernacle and the temple and the great heroes of the faith like Moses, and yet the people never bloomed. They never prospered. They never flourished. They never left their sin. And so those things were all insufficient to bring about the kind of people, the kind of nation that God wanted to bring. They never came into being God's people the way that God had designed. They needed something radically different outside of themselves to transform them. And so they come up to the fig tree and it's withered, and they're like, oh, Jesus cursed this for fruitlessness. Except now look at what Jesus says. He teaches them. He goes, do you see this withered fig tree? Have faith, and what? If you have faith, you can say to this mountain, move, or have faith and you can pray and God will give it to you. What's the point of that? The point of that is not to be able to curse fig trees, although that would be cool. The point of that is the fig tree was cursed for fruitlessness. What brings fruitlessness? Faith. It isn't going to be the law. It isn't going to be the prophets. It isn't going to be the covenant people. It is going to be faith. Faith gets the ear of God. That's the whole point. They come up to this fig tree, and Jesus is like, man, this fig tree is cursed. But if you have faith, you get God's ear. If you have faith, whatever you pray for, God will give it to you. What does that really point to? It's pointing to that faith gets the ear of God. You can say to this mountain, move. It's by faith fruit grows. That's the big difference. So that's scene 1. Then scene 2 starts in verse 27, and it goes all the way through chapter 12. And we're not going to read the whole thing. It's so much. But this next scene is what happens inside the temple on day 2. Now, Jesus comes back to the temple on Tuesday. That must have been awkward, because the day before he's turning over tables, he made a whip, he's not letting anybody carry anything, he's knocking stuff out of people's hands, he's loud, obnoxious, and all because the buying and selling is happening in the courts of the Gentiles, and that the poor are being taken advantage of. And so here Jesus walks in the temple. Could you imagine, like, everything goes quiet? What's he gonna do today? How's it gonna go down today? That's awkward. If you like messed a bunch of stuff up yesterday and you come walking through the temple today, people are gonna be looking at you, and they're ready, and they pounce. And what I love about these chapters on this day is some of the most familiar parables and teachings that we have of Jesus happened on this day. I mean, think about it. This is the day that we have give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and it's about whether or not we should pay taxes. And he says, hey, whose image is on the coin? Give to Caesar's. There's the parable of the tenants, and about the tenant who comes to want to collect the money, and he sends a servant, and then he says, I'll send my son. Will they reject my son? And then the story, they end up rejecting the son, killing the son, and then the landowner comes, and it's a representation that God is going to do everything, and he's going to send every servant, even his servant of his own son, to come, and they're going to kill him. They're going to reject him. We have about the resurrection, about like, what if you've been married to multiple people? Who will you be married to in heaven? That's a good question, because that would get awkward. And so we have this story about marriage in heaven, and will there be marriage in heaven? And then we have the great commandment, one of the most familiar teachings of Jesus, right? The most important commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor like yourself. We come back to the great commandment over and over. It got taught on this day, on Tuesday of Holy Week. And so it's amazing. And you can go into Matthew. There's 5 chapters of Jesus teaching incredible, familiar stories, and it all happened on this day, and it happened in the temple. And the point of it is why. We're told in verse 27 of chapter 11 that when Jesus came into Jerusalem and he came into the temple, it says, as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they challenged him, they tested him, they quizzed him. And each of those stories that we love so much, each of those teachings and parables that happen on this day, on Tuesday, you'll find that it was a scribe who came and challenged Jesus. It was a religious leader who came and asked him questions. It was somebody trying to test him and capture him. It was the scribes who came and challenged the authority of Jesus, and Jesus has given us this incredible teaching. And the whole point of it, I think, is that notice it's not unbelievers, it's not skeptics, it was the religious that were challenging Jesus. It reminds me in Revelation, one of the letters that is written to the church says, man, if you're lukewarm, God will spit you out. And he's addressing one of the churches that have become lukewarm. And what does lukewarm means? Neither hot nor cold, but it means, you know what, you know about God, you know about the truth, but you're cold in the way you live it. So you're hot in your knowledge, but you're cold in its application, and therefore you're lukewarm. And notice it's the religious people, the people that should have seen Jesus for who he was, who worshiped Jesus for who he was, who understood the Old Testament and should have said, this is the Messiah. They knew the truth. They were hot with the truth, but they were cold in their worship and in their application of that truth. And being lukewarm is one of the most dangerous places, not because it's worse than being cold. I think there's some people that teach like, oh, better to be cold. Well, no, that's not good either, because the cold are the curse. They get no life at the end of this life either. Religious are in a more dangerous place because the religious think they know. The religious think they have life. The religious think they're clean. The religious think that they've done enough. The religious think they have the favor of God on their side. But like the fig tree, it's fruitlessness, which it all comes back to the figs, that it's by faith alone that we bear fruit. The third scene on this Tuesday comes out of Mark chapter 13, 1 through 2. And here's what it says. And as he came out of the temple, so first it was going in the temple, then we have the whole scene inside the temple of being challenged by the religious, and then the third scene is right outside the temple. And so it says, and they came out of the temple. One of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones, what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be one left here, one stone upon the other that will not be thrown down." And then he goes into a bunch of signs. And this third scene is right outside the temple. You got to know the temple was like a wonder of the world. It took 46 years to build, and it was still in construction. So for some of these people's entire life, the disciples' entire life, for some of them, was watching this temple be built. And Jesus, right outside, I mean, they're just blown away. Look at these stones. I've never seen anything so big, so gargantuan, so great. You know, just blowing their mind. And Jesus goes, let me blow your mind. These stones, this temple, knock it down. And you'll see not even one stone will be on top of the other, which would be amazing. It would take an incredible amount of power for those gigantic stones to be moved like that. But Jesus is talking about the temple, which ultimately gets destroyed 30 years later. But he's referencing not that temple, but he himself. Remember, the temple was where heaven meets earth. We talked about that yesterday. Jesus is the temple. Jesus is where heaven meets earth. It's where God meets man, and it's in Christ. And so when he talks about these giant stones, he's talking about himself, the giant stones of heaven, right? He's called the cornerstone, and in just a couple of days, he'll be killed. The stones will be overthrown. Could you imagine that heaven itself will be toppled over? That's the crucifixion. That's what's coming up. And Jesus is referencing that. And we know that in part of the other Gospels where we're told he's actually talking about his body, the temple. Heaven gets overthrown. The great cornerstone gets killed. That is mind-blowing. Jesus is greater than the temple. He is the wonder of the world, not just one of the wonders of the world. And he's about to be toppled. And then he teaches all through chapter 13, what are the signs after Jesus dies and resurrects? What are the signs of the coming of the kingdom? And then it says he returns. And so on this day, on Tuesday, Jesus teaches a lot, but he comes into the temple. He teaches in the temple, and then he comes out of the temple. And each of them are pointing to faith and fruitfulness, all resulting from the death of Jesus. I hope you have a great Holy Week Tuesday. We'll see you tomorrow.